Alright guys, so welcome back, and in this video I want to start looking at how we can create the top-down game that I showed you in the first preview video. So I've opened up a brand new project, and you can go ahead and do that as well. And I have brought in some of the assets, so I will show you which ones. Our character and monster are from this little free pack, Animated Knight and Slime Monster. Of course, you are free to use whatever models you want to use, but if you want to follow along, these are the ones that I used. And for our environment, we have this pack. I think this is a really good pack. It's hard for me to see how it just has 5 downloads because it's just so beautiful. And yeah, I mean, I think you can really make some cool prototype environments with this, and this is something I guess I'll be using a lot in the future. So these are the two that I wanted to mention. Just a couple of honorable mentions, which I just saw, are this little floor segment. So maybe we can put this to use somehow. It seems like a cool little ornament. Maybe some sort of waypoint, checkpoint, something like that. Same thing for this one. I think this just looks absolutely sick. It reminds me of some sort of waypoint, and maybe we can make that work somehow in our game as well. And the stylized crystal. So you don't just get these yet, but I just wanted to point these out for you guys in your games, etc. But we can also maybe use them later on in our game somehow. So go ahead and import those. I've already done that. Now I've also imported a couple of more, like the effects and things like that, but I will tell you guys about that a little bit later when we get to that point. So go ahead and do that. Once you have done that, I've gone ahead and made my environment. Now I didn't want to, the reason why I'm just gonna go ahead and drag and drop the environment is because I didn't want to bore you through me trying to piece this puzzle together. For a couple of reasons, because first of all, in my last Crazy Cabby design tutorial, I just didn't seem to get very many views, so I'm guessing that people don't really want to see me design. So that's, I mean, it's a bit, I mean, I don't like the sound of that, simply because if you're working in Unity, you kind of need to be at least be able to put things together in a reasonable and pretty way. And honestly, if you've tried, I'm still learning as well, but putting together a nice coherent environment is something that takes a little bit of practice. But anyways, I'm not going to go through with it, but here it is. I think it's very simple, so I'll just walk you through what it is. And again, I've just really put it together nicely and neatly like so. But of course, you don't have to like that. But I just wanted to make it a prefab and such. So the floor is just a bunch of tiles. So it's, what is it, 6 by 6? Yeah, so it's 6 by 6. I just chose this particular pattern because it looked nice. You can make a different pattern and such. On the corners, I put some columns. So again, columns are, well, columns from that tavern pack that I just showed you. For the walls, I used 3D objects, 3D game object cubes, and on the walls I put the plaster texture which came with the pack, and I thought that looked really nice. The walls were like so all the way around, except in the front I cut them short because I wanted the, you know, we were going for this RPG style cut environment type 3D perspective, third-person perspective type situation. So this is pretty much all there is to the environment. So go ahead and draw up your environment. It doesn't have to look exactly the same as mine, and it doesn't even have to be as small as mine. So feel free to make a cool little maze, etc., whatever you want. But that's how it should be. Now, before I go forward, I just want to say here that once you have made your environment, it's always nice to arrange them like so. So all your floor, you know, create an empty child, create an empty object, and put all your floor tiles as a child to that, so you know exactly where the floor is and exactly where the walls are and such. Okay, and maybe then create an environment game object which you can put nicely in your hierarchy like that. And also don't forget to make this a prefab. Now, another thing I want to say is, since all of these things in your environment right now are not going to be moving, it's really a good idea to label them as static. Okay, what I mean by that is, so you click on a particular game object and you check static here. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more important very soon, but I would go ahead and make all of these game objects as static. Okay, so the same thing for the walls. Now, making this here the child object, the game object which contains all those walls static, is not important. Okay, that doesn't get the job done because it but you want to go ahead and make these individual walls static. Okay, anything pretty much that is not moving, go ahead and make that static. All the columns and such, make that static. And that'll and I'll tell you why that is so important in a few minutes. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to bring in my character. So there is our character. So here he is. He looks fine. Okay, so there is our character, and while I'm here I can go ahead and bring in my monster as well. Let's move him here like so. And alright. Okay, so here's what we're going to be doing. We've got our player, we've got our monster, and in this video I want to talk about player movement. Okay, so first of all, I'll go ahead and I'll rename my character as player. I'm also going to set his tag as player. Now, the way we're going to be moving in this moving our character is going to be something with using something called a Nav Mesh Agent. Okay, so a Nav Mesh Agent is, if you go over here and if you press Add Component and start typing, then here it is, Nav Mesh Agent. Nav Mesh Agent is something like so. As you can see, there's a green little outline on your character telling you that, well, he is in fact now a Nav Mesh Agent. And a Nav Mesh Agent is something which can walk on a Nav Mesh. Now, you're probably thinking like, hold on. If you've never worked with Nav Mesh Agents or heard these terms before, you're probably a little bit more confused. But don't worry, it's very simple, okay? So once we put this Nav Mesh Agent on our component, what we need to do is we need to specify our environment as a Nav Mesh. Okay, because both of these components, they work together. So as soon as we have, if we can somehow specify, if we can tell Unity that, all right, use certain parts of our environment as a nav mesh, those parts on which our player can walk on, for example, if we can specify them as part of our nav mesh, then our player will know where it can move. Okay, so the way you can do that is if you go over here and in Windows, you open up your navigations tab. So for me, it's over here. Then what you can do is, this is where that part where I said mark everything that doesn't move as static. If I go ahead and hit bake here, then notice what's going to happen. It creates this blue little area. You notice this? Now this blue little area is my nav mesh. The reason why it perfectly carved out this blue little area is because, as I said before, if you marked all of your floor and all of your walls and columns and such as static, then it pretty much tells it pretty much tells Unity that these things can be a part of the nav mesh and things like that. Now you might say, well, hey, why are the walls not a part of your nav mesh? Because if everything is static, then maybe everything which is static means blue and things like that, which would be a very valid question. So let's see what's different over here, right? Now when I go on my walls, right, I have marked them as static, but if you go back into the navigation tab and if I click over here on object, notice how over here it says it's checked navigation static, but I've made all of my walls not walkable. Okay, so over here I'm telling Unity that you cannot walk on these walls. Similarly, if you look at these columns, right, let's look at this column. Notice how it's navigation static, but it's also not walkable. So anything in the environment which you don't want your Nav Mesh Agent, that is your player, to not walk on, you have to specifically specify that it is not walkable. Now let's look on the floor. Let's look at this tile. Notice how it is navigation static, but at the same time it is walkable, so the player can walk. So this is why all of this floor is selected in this blue little nav mesh, and none of these walls and pillars are. Okay, so I want you to think of a nav mesh as some sort of a piece of cloth which is laid right on top of your little tiles, and it tells your Nav Mesh agent that you can walk on top of it. Now in our game, we're going to have two Nav Mesh agents. Our player is going to be the Nav Mesh agent that we control, and we're going to have an AI controlled Nav Mesh agent, and the AI will use the same Nav Mesh. Okay, so I hope that makes a little bit more sense. And that's all I want to say about that. But for this to work, again, it's very important that you set all of the non-moving parts as static. And then later on, before you hit the bake button, it's important that you make all of the not walkable objects in your environment as not walkable. If I were to show you a slight demonstration, let me go ahead and do that. If I duplicate this pillar like so, and if I move it here in the middle, notice how nothing changed. Okay, absolutely nothing changed. If my player could move, he would not even recognize. If my player could move right now, and if I hit play, then he would not recognize that that pillar is there because the nav mesh has not been updated. But now if I bake again, and if I update my nav mesh, notice how the nav mesh realizes that, hey, there is a static non-walkable object right in the middle, and it pretty much cuts a hole in the nav mesh, right? So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, okay? But after you delete it, don't forget to re-update your nav mesh, otherwise your player won't be able to come here using this old nav mesh. Alright, so I hope that makes sense so far. Now let's look at our player again. So our nav mesh seems to be, the boundaries seems to be a little bit big, so let's go ahead, go back on our inspector here, and let's adjust that a little bit. And make the height a little bit more reasonable. So I think 1 is a good number to be. And also let's adjust the radius. So radius, and we can change the radius a little bit more later on, but let's just make it, yeah. Okay, so now that we have that ready, you can, let's create some movement for this player. So create a new folder called scripts. I've already done that, and in your scripts folder, create a new script called player move. Also, I have done that. So let's double click and open it. Now notice how I have already put in a script. Do not freak out. I will explain to you everything. Okay, do not just start typing. I will explain to you everything. And once again, you'll notice that I have purposely commented out a lot of stuff which is not going to be important right now. Okay, now moving with Nav Mesh Agents is very, very simple. The reason why it's very simple is because a nav mesh has something called a function called move. Okay, and move pretty much just takes a vector 3, which is going to determine where you want your nav mesh agent to move. Okay, and we will be using that idea extensively. So let's look at how we can do that. Okay, I have a private variable here. Private vector 3 goal. Okay, so go ahead and write that down. We have a private nav mesh agent. So this is the agent that we just created, the component on our player. Okay, and we have a move input. We'll look at that a little bit later. So in our start function, we define what the goal needs to be for our nav mesh agent. Now again, this will be a little bit more clear in just a few minutes, but initially the goal is going to be a vector 3, which is going to hold a vector 3 where our player needs to be. Okay, so at the very start of the game, our player doesn't need to be anywhere except where it already is. So I'm just setting the goal to be transform.position, that is setting it to the position that the player is actually at, to himself basically. Next thing, what we need to do is we need to actually access our nav mesh agent. So we need to do that using get component. So when you do agent equals to get component nav mesh agent, of course by get component you should already know this by now, but it will go on your player and it will search for a nav mesh agent component and it will return it, and you can save it in this variable. Okay, so now we have both of those. Okay, now what we need to do is basically somehow update our goal. So if the user is pressing a button, if the user is pressing the right button or the left button or the up button or the down button on the keyboard, then we want to get the user input, and depending on what the user input is, we want to update the goal. And once we have updated the goal somehow, then we can simply use this one line of code, agent.destination equals goal, and we can cause the player to move. Okay, so the way I've done that is in this single line of code. The goal, where the player needs to be, is the transform.position, which is the current position of the player, plus vector3.right times input.getAccess horizontal. Now you're thinking, whoa, what is going on here? Okay, input.getAccess horizontal pretty much is a way of getting the user input and checking if the user is pressing the right arrow key or the left arrow key on the keyboard. Okay, it also works for A and D keys. Okay, and it also works for your joystick automatically. Okay, so all three of those will work. The right key, or if you press right on your joystick, or if you press the D key. So what happens is input.getAccess basically returns a number between 1 and -1, I believe. And if you press the right key, then it's going to return 1. And if you press the left key, it's going to return -1. So what I'm doing here is basically transform.position. I'm getting the current position, and I'm adding to that vector3.right is just saying a vector in the right direction. As you can see, if you hover over it, then you'll notice that it is a shorthand for writing a vector which has a 1 in the x-axis. What am I saying? So a vector3.right is just a shorthand for a vector3 1 0 0. So which has an x value of 1 and a y and z of 0. Okay, so vector3.right is just the right direction. Okay, and if the user is pressing the right key, then input.getAccess horizontal is going to return 1. So 1 times 1 in this case is going to be, well, what I mean is 1 times the vector 1 0 0 is going to be still the vector 1 0 0. I hope that makes sense. And if the user is pressing the left key, then this is going to return -1, and -1 times the vector 1 0 0 is going to be -1 0 0. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so we're just going to be getting the current position of the user. We're going to be adding in this vector. And then we're also going to be checking if the user is pressing the up or down key. And this is the same exact thing for right and left. So input.getAccess vertical basically checks if the up key or the down key is pressed, or the W or the S, or the joystick is pressed up or the joystick is pressed down. So again, I want to repeat, input.getAccess vertical is going to return a value. If you jam the up button, it's going to return 1, and if you jam the down button, it's going to return -1. And vector3.forward is once again just a shorthand for writing a vector, so 0 0 1 in this case. So a vector which has just a 1 in the z magnitude, and we're going to be multiplying that with 1 or -1 to pretty much alter the position of our player, because notice our player is only going to be moving in the x and the z direction. Okay, so our player is either going to be moving like so, right, and like so. It's not at the moment going to be jumping. So I hope that kind of makes sense what we're trying to do. I'm going to go ahead and reset our player to 0 and 0. Okay, so in doing so, we now have a goal. And with this simple line of code, agent.destination equals to goal, we can tell our Nav Mesh agent to go to that goal. I'm going to comment out this line because this is not important. And I hope that this makes sense. Now, if I go back to my player, if I attach the script that we just made, then hopefully we should see some progress. Now, before I hit play, let me see where my camera is. My camera seems to be okay, so let's hit play. And if I now hit left, our player is going left. And if I now hit right, our player is moving right. Let me bring my camera a little bit closer so I can make some changes. So okay, so let me hit play one more time. And you notice how my player seems to be moving. Now he's turning a little bit slowly, so I want to change that. If I go on my player while in the run mode, what I want to try changing is its angular speed. So let's bump that up by a lot, 1200, and also change its acceleration to 20. And let's see how that looks. Notice how it's a lot more snappier now, and I'm pretty happy with this movement. As you can see, our player is doing exactly what we want. When I press the left key, it goes left. Now it's going right, and it will also go at different. It will also go right and top and left and things like that. So I hope that makes sense. This is how we move using a Nav Mesh agent. Once again, the main thing to know here is that we attached a Nav Mesh agent onto our player. We then went and accessed it here. So in our start menu, we got that component and we were simply telling it a destination point, okay? So an agent.destination simply requires a vector3 where we want to move. And since we were doing this in update, then, we were pretty much checking every single frame if the user is pressing the right key or the left key, and depending on what he's pressing, we were moving him just a little bit in that direction. I hope that makes sense, and that is all I want to say for this video. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and once again, if you like this tutorial series, then don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you think that you learned something, or if there's any questions that you have, then feel free to drop a comment and let me know. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.